of Technically Speaking. Welcome to our second episode of Technically Speaking. I am here today with Kyle Christiansen, a member of my team. Kyle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Kyle Christiansen, working on the solution architecture team here at Uncork, and happy to join the conversation this morning.
Great. Welcome, Kyle. We are here today to talk about APIs. It is one of a topic that I found incredibly intimidating when I started at Uncork. So we're going to start with the basics. What does API even stand for?
Well, API is an acronym, stands for Application Programming Interfaces or interface. And it really is that kind of front door to get into a massive amount of technology behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's great. When you say front door, how would we interact with it? What does it make available when we open that door?
So, speaking from an API, it's usually some sort of sharing of data, right? But APIs can be a lot of things. They could be a command to a system. They can be a trigger about a file. Um, but it is helping to give that gate to hopefully obfuscate of everything that's behind it, um, to really let someone in. And the easiest way to think about it is you want to get a piece of data, you want to make a request, you kind of get that data back.
Great. So it sounds like a good use case would be something modular as well, where I can call it once, you can call it, a third party system could call it as well.
Absolutely. So when we talk about APIs, there's usually different flavors of them as people build throughout their systems, and they may even make a public version versus an internal version versus a something in between. Um, so it depends on the design of the builder of those APIs and the company or entity or organization that you're communicating with on really what that definition is. But absolutely, it you can make as many as you want, and it becomes kind of that building block or a Lego piece of usually some sort of larger system.
That's great. Now that we know what they are, how do they work?
How do they work?
Mhm.
Well, so let's maybe take an example that I think everyone will understand is think a power outlet in your home
Okay.
or in the restaurant you're at or the coffee shop you're at, wherever you happen to be watching the stream from. At no point do you, the user of that power outlet, need to be an electrician, right? You are not connecting your laptop to the electrical grid to charge its battery. You have this interface that is that plug that sits in the wall, right? And think of that, there are different flavors, right? So the plug we have in the United States are slightly different than what you're going to find in Europe or other countries, right? So there are different ways of connecting to that same thing, but it is still connecting to a power outlet,
Yeah.
right? And so when you decide that you want to get power from it, you're going to plug your device in, and you don't really care how that works behind the scenes, usually. You may be curious about it, but for the most part, it's I plug this in, I now have power to my outlet. That interface, that is that plug, is kind of like an API, right? So it is now connecting you to something super complicated behind the scenes, which is our electrical grid. But you don't care about that because you have an easy just connection to get into it.
That's a great analogy. It really puts into perspective the complexities that are being hidden from you, the power that's being hidden from you, but you have kind of this very simple interface that may be different every time that you're trying to
Mhm.
plug in, but it does kind of connect. Um, how do I communicate with an API? You talked about the different plugs that we might have
Yeah.
in Europe or the US or Asia, and, how do I know what to plug in?
Right. So there's it maybe first we talk about an endpoint or a URL, right? So as you go to a website, right, you type google.com in your browser, you've now said, I would like to visit google.com, right? And there's a lot of requests that happen behind the scenes to get you to the right server and entity and all of this, and Google is brought up on your laptop, right? Um, and an API has that same type of destination, right?
Okay.
There is a URL typically that you're going to go to, um, and it's going to sometimes take parameters, right? So, like going to Google, you may enter in a Google search, right? So, I may want to search for Uncork because I want to find the link to that website. I didn't remember what their domain was. You've now sent it some data to receive that data back, right? And so, depending upon the API that you're communicating with, there's always going to be some sort of what we'll typically call a contract, right? So, the author of that API, the entity or person that built that API is going to say, for you to use this, you might just call it, and I'm going to give you data. Or I may need, as the API, personify the API, I may need a bit of information from you to give you the right data back based on who you are, the type of data you're looking for, um, to really receive that kind of communication of I'm asking for this, kind of give me that information back to me.
And is that information back always going to come the same? So if I call Kyle's API, I'm always going to get back an array of with these 3 fields in it, or is it always gonna look a little different?
That's an amazing question. So by saying the word array, let's maybe break that down a bit and talk about data, right?
Yes.
So exchanging information kind of comes with it that data, right? And that data usually is in some sort of format. Um, that format, very popular from an API communication perspective, is called JSON, which is a structured set of data. But it could be XML, it could be just straight text. The response could be an actual file download. It is a lot of things there. But I think for the purpose of just general understanding, uh, the type of data you get back is going to be structured and parsable, typically. And depending upon the type of information you're looking for, it may be very large, it may be very small.
Okay, great. So you mentioned the type of data. Um, are there different patterns or formats that we would get that data or call that data in?
So yeah, so I did mention JSON as a format. There is XML, right? So a few different words happening there. The There's various patterns that you'll see out there as it relates to API called REST is a type of pattern that is typically tied with JSON type data returned. Doesn't have to be, but it usually is. Um, we have a SOAP pattern that usually communicates in an XML type way. uh, Both of these kind of data patterns are kind of standard, right? So SOAP is actually defined and a published standard from the World Wide Web Consortium. Um, JSON is kind of started with JavaScript. JSON actually um, JavaScript notation is what it stands for behind the scenes. But the pattern of RESTful APIs, which is just a way of um, kind of building out what you have to know that what you're building is similar to what someone else builds. So that way, all of the consumers around the world that might need your APIs have a way of interpreting what you're putting out there to better understand. So that way, it's not just you know everybody's custom, and then you have to learn something again and again. So it's keeping to those kind of standards to um, make it easier to consume that data that you're presenting or exchanging with your end users.
Okay. And have I been using APIs this whole time and I just didn't know what they were and how they worked, and they've been controlling my life?
They absolutely have. Let's maybe take a few examples. So there's a lot of weather happening right now, especially on the East Coast. So hopefully everyone is staying safe if you are in the Southeast. Um, but let's take the weather that's on your phone, right?
Okay.
That's likely some sort of widget on your home screen, right, of your device. And behind the scenes, that little widget is calling an API to say, hey, give me the weather for the location that this phone is in. So I am in Washington, D.C. My phone is constantly saying, hey, I know Kyle's phone is in DC. Can you tell me the weather API? What's there? Right.
Right.
So think of when we talked about kind of inputs and outputs. Um, my phone knows that I am in a specific location, right?
Right.
Whether that be a city, whether that be a zip code, whether that be the longitude, latitude of map. And it's sending that location, just general location information to a weather API. And that API is coming back and saying, here's the weather for today. So we have a high of, I think we have a high of like 68 degrees today. It's a little chilly here compared to what it's been. It will kind of provide that information on um, what might be coming, right? Maybe we have a thunderstorm coming. The Hurricane Ian's kind of coming up the coast. Um, but then thinking about, oh, if I see that information on my home screen, I may click into it to get some more details. Maybe I want to see, well, when can I expect rain in the Washington, D.C. area? And I want to see that hour by hour, right? So we may have started with this very generic API on what's the temperature and the forecast for the DC area. Drilling into it, maybe I call in a more specific endpoint that will give me the hour by hour forecast, right? And you probably don't know anything about it, but your phone is configured to make those interchanges with an API behind the scenes to kind of give you that contextual data about the weather in your uh, location.
Absolutely. And to think something that we take for granted, like the weather app, is making all of those calls behind the scenes for us. Are there also fun examples, right? Weather is fun-ish.
Yeah, yeah. So let's take an example of Netflix, right?
Okay.
Everyone likes to stream their favorite show, whether that's binging or watching a movie, or uh, today's Friday, which means the next episode of The Great British Bake Off is dropping on Netflix. If you're into that one. Um, so when you go to pull that up, whether that's on your TV, whether that's on your laptop or your other devices, uh, you're logging in, you're getting that screen that says, hey, here's all of these various things that we think you're going to be interested in, right? So you have a row of information of stuff you've previously watched, right? You'll have a row of information on, hey, what is the kind of top 5, 10 things being watched in the United States at this time, right? What is the most popular for everybody? Um, and there may be recommendations, right? It's almost October, and I will tell you the recommendations on our Netflix is going to be lots of scary movies and horror that's coming up. And so think of each one of those rows of kind of recommendations and links to various things that you may be interested in watching. Each one of those is going to be an API behind the scenes to pull that data from the the server farm of Netflix over to your device, right? So it now says, here are the 10 things that you have actively been watching. By the way, there's a new episode of Great British Bake Off. Click here and start watching, right? And that, top 10 of what's happening in the United States to maybe get you interested in what is everybody else binging because you're looking for something new. Each one of those are going to be APIs behind the scenes. So as we talked about building blocks to get that screen, which is, hey, there's a lot of recommendations for me. I wanna see all of that, and it's now put together in that visual way. That was an undetermined amount of APIs behind the scenes to collect all of that data and now present it to the end user.
Yeah. And so now that we've talked about APIs kind of generally out in the world, maybe let's come back to what we do every day in Uncork.
Yes.
How do we call APIs in Uncork?
So similarly to when we talked about going to a web page of Google, right?
Right.
It is a URL, right? So when you same way where you have www.google.com, that that generates a web page when there is a request. There is a URL pattern that likely is going to be the same thing but in API form, right?
Okay.
So from an Uncork perspective, you have your environment that's on uncork.io, and there's specific URL that you'll get to generate a preview of your particular module that you have configured, right? And so just by changing the URL that you're using to access that, and we use slash API to get to that route there, you've now been able to take your configuration from a kind of web page presentable UI something to a data driven API instead, right? So the exact same configuration that you have and logic that you put together serves both an API functionality and a UI functionality to help you really build kind of what you need to build, right? So from an Uncork perspective, uh, we try and make it super easy, right? You don't have to understand all of that nuance behind the scenes to make it all work. You can fully leverage that kind of drag and drop there, and you are now an API guru and can start building all of your various pieces to get what you need.
And do we have to do anything in particular special to that module in order to make it accessible by the API, or that's just out of the box how it works? It can go
You know,
either way.
out of the box, it's there. As a configurator, there's always a tester button of server side execute, which is communicating with your module from an API perspective. So at its core, just to make it function, you don't really have to do much at all. However, there is always that kind of advanced settings that you may find, right? Because you may want to say, I specifically built this module to be an API. I don't want to have that UI functionality to it, right? I only want to have it be that data driven uh, interchange and exchange with people using my configuration that I put together. Then you very much have those higher level settings. You can say, hey, I only want this to be an API. We can mark that down, right?
Nice.
And again, you also have the power of the configuration to make it secure to specific roles and groups and all of that. So there's a lot that goes down there, but truly out of the box, you can call any one of the modules that you've now configured kind of as an API and see what that looks like.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm excited to go back and make some more API modules after this.
Yes.
If I wanted to learn more about APIs, I know when we were talking earlier, you mentioned a few things. Where would you send somebody to do an introduction to APIs?
Yes. So I always like to send for kind of web type topics. There's a website called MDN, or it used to be called the Mozilla Developer Network. Um, that is, you can just search for MDN and topics, so MDN APIs. It'll take you there. They do a great job of talking about these types of uh, technologies and topics and breaking it down both from a very kind of simplistic, I am starting on square one, I need to know what this information is, and starting to build on them over time. So whether that's APIs, and then that takes you down a rabbit hole of wanting to talk about JavaScript or anything like that, I always find that that is a really great place to start, kind of get your bearings, and then kind of work your way up to more kind of advanced topics that you might want to see.
Very cool. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
teaching us all about APIs and answering all my questions today.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we will be back next week breaking down more topics, asking more questions.